Hey there, guys. Welcome back to the H3X podcast, where Dave Miller and I, Mark Goering, we explore the head, the heart, the hands of the multiplying church and her leaders. And today, Dave and I want to talk about the genius of the two church model. And I'm going to tee this one up. That's a clickbait title if ever there was, Dave. I'm sorry for that.
You're good at
But
it, Mark. I'll let you do your thing.
we're gonna get people on. We've already got people clicking on, maybe for that reason. But no, we are gonna unpack the role of church today in God's kingdom and how just smart Jesus was in setting up the church and how the church's role fits into multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches. We had an immersion here in New York City this spring, and immersion just being we had disciples come in, they experienced our habits and rhythms alongside of us and joined us for that and got to see it. And we started out that immersion by using this phrase, you cannot follow what you cannot see. And I think that when I say that, the reason I say that is because most disciple making training fails because people, they hear it, they go through the content, but they can't see it. And so there's a problem with the way that we have done training that as of today we want to talk about this idea of the two church model. But the reason why is because oftentimes we do training in such a way that people can't reproduce it. And so I want to start out there, Dave, of just before we even get into what the two church model means. Um, has that how have you experienced that where people they come up, they're a part of a training, but they go through it, but then how do I actually reproduce this?
Yeah, it's the difference between us trying to share knowledge and us being able to say the two church model is really our way of saying we want to immerse you in not only going to church but leading and participating in church as someone who's responsible for what's going on, and realizing that the best way to learn is to put you in an environment where you have to do the thing, and it's okay to fail first, fail fast, fail forward. And if we don't create environments where people can do that, fail first, fail fast, fail forward, and realize it's okay to be in process, then
Yes.
they're never going to get to the place to where the process gets completed. They grow in maturity and are able to reproduce it in other people's lives. Otherwise, they're just stuck in, I'm scared and paralyzed in, I don't want to do something wrong.
Right. And you're yes. And so we end up in this place where we have lots of information, but then it ends up in paralysis because of all the little nuance of it. And one phrase that I've used over the years is so much of the kingdom is caught, not taught. And, there are those intuitive few, which I used to put, Dave, at maybe that's 50 or 60% of the population, maybe, or more than that, are intuitive. Maybe I even went as high as 80%. Yeah, there's the intuitive people. Let's start with them. Let's invest in them. They're going to get this. They're going to run with this. And I have been humbled by trying to actually do this stuff. That number is quite a bit lower. How high would you say are the intuitive leaders out there that when they see this stuff, they're able to turn around and actually do it? What percentage would you
I
give to it?
I would say 5% or less. That's
That
where
was
I
the
would put
number
it.
in my mind. Yeah, 5% or less. And I've had mentors and others saying, "Me, oh no, Mark, it's way lower." I'm like, "Are you serious? It's 5% or less? Like, really?" That when they see the methods and when they read about the way of Jesus, they're able to turn around and do it. And so that's the problem. That all that tees us up for the problem of if if there's only about 5% of the population that when they get around or they look online at content for how to make and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches, there's only 5% that can do it intuitively. Why do we continue to train disciples in a way that requires them to be intuitive to turn around and do the stuff? That's a problem because it means our very way of training is actually assuming that you're going to be intuitive with the information we just showed you in a classroom setting, and you're going to be able to turn around on Tuesday and do this. And that's just not the case. And so all
Yeah,
that
and
sets us up. Go ahead.
I
Yeah.
was going to say, and to your point, because trainings are always nice and neat and clean, it's very, very hard to take those training modules, and they may get them and they may go to apply them. But the problem is that the world doesn't respond to the training modules the way that they're supposed to. And then you've got to have that experience to know, what do I do whenever the training that said do this and you get this doesn't have just step one, step two, that there's 10 steps in a year in between those steps. Like, what do I do? That's what you got to learn.
Yeah, so it's extremely messy is one piece of it, but so much of the nuance of how do I actually share the gospel with somebody in a real life situation, I can go just fail forward and do it. And some people are going to get activated just by because they're naturally just go getters and they're going to try. But most people are not going to do that unless they have somebody do it with them and try it. And most people, if they're trying to start a simple Bible study in their living room, they need somebody to come alongside of them and do it with them in a way that can reproduce. Maybe you can start a Bible study, but is it going to actually reproduce? And so to get there, Dave, this is what I wanted you to talk about. We've got to embrace one of your new favorite phrases, which is temporary incompetence.
Yeah.
So why do you love
Uh,
that phrase right now?
Well, temporary incompetence explains another way of saying fell first, fell fast, fell forward. It's just a way of describing the fact that we have to get to the place to where we realize that we aren't going to be competent and we aren't going to have confidence, but it's not permanent. And so that allows us to get into a place and realize I can do this for a little bit. And I think, Mark, anytime we think something hard in life is going to come around, no matter what it is in life, it could be something with family, it could be something with health, it could be something with, even learning something, going to college. If we know that there's a timeline for it, people are able to endure quite a bit if we know there's an endpoint. The reason that most people hesitate to have incompetence is because they don't know what the endpoint is. And so temporary incompetence is telling us there is actually going to be a point at which you're no longer incompetent in this. But you just got to realize there's a little bit of time. Suck it up. It's okay. Go and fail on purpose. And there's going to be a place where you're going to learn. And it just gives us the freedom to go. This is the learning zone, if you will.
Yeah, and I want to talk about two things in response to what you just said. A really helpful way to talk about how we've got to lean into that. I have a friend who talks about movement methods inoculation. We've podcasted on that in the past, Dave,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think it's very possible for us to go to a training in a sanitized, safe setting. We run through the reps on whatever tool it might be and how to share the gospel, start making a new disciple. And if we haven't practiced it, haven't done it, we can actually trick ourselves into thinking, oh, it's really easy, it's really straightforward, all of those kinds of things. And we don't have competence yet. What we have is vision, and we've removed some of the barriers to action, which is good. We do need to have some of those barriers lowered to where it's like, oh, I could go step out and try this, but we do not have competence yet. And so by embracing the idea of temporary incompetence, of saying like, yeah, I'm going to humble myself, even though I think I just got that. There's
Right.
a lot that I still need to learn, and step out. We begin to learn what we don't know. So that's one. And then the second piece is I've seen that competence is actually gained through reps. It doesn't come through information. And if it was information alone, Lord knows we're drowning in that, right? If you can get on YouTube and you have the skills to use YouTube or Google and type in or Chat GPT and you can type something in, you can learn anything. And so if that was truly enough to get us competent, there would be competent disciple makers running around all over the place. There's not. Why? Because information alone doesn't get you to competency. We have to embrace that temporary incompetence and understand that if I get in some reps and begin to do this with other disciples in a church, in a community of practice, I can actually become really effective.
So I'll give you a very practical example. Recently, just had a conversation with a gentleman who had been trained in the past using the 15-second story, which is just there was a time in my life when I was selfish and didn't like really authority at all. And I realized Jesus came down on the cross, died for my sins, and rose on the third day, and I made him Lord of my life. And now I'm becoming a much more generous person, and I want to submit to his authority because he's good. Do you have a story like that? Okay, that's the 15-second story. It's a tool that we
Right.
train to help people just get started in transitioning conversations from right casual to meaningful to spiritual to discovery. And a 15-second story is a great way to take a meaningful conversation or a casual conversation and to transition it real quick to the spiritual. As I was talking with this gentleman, his answer was, I did the 15-second story and it doesn't really work. And I said, you haven't used it enough. If you had done lots and lots of reps of the 15-second story, you would realize that the point of the 15-second story is not a 15-second story to share.
Mm,
The point of the
yes.
15-second story is to gain the skills necessary to transition everyday conversations to gospel conversations.
Right.
And if you learn how to go, I want to listen to what somebody says and ask good questions and be curious, genuinely curious, then the way tell them something about themselves, that gives you a chance to tell your side of the story. You tell something about yourself and you insert into that story very quickly the transition to where you want to go next. And you let that person then go to that next step. It's a way in which you take what we were talking about, acknowledge what we're talking about, tell something that's going to take me to the next step, and then ask them if they've gone to the next step. And that skill has to be developed through reps.
Yes.
And
And
he was
reps.
inoculated to the tool because he
Yeah.
tried it once, it didn't work, but he didn't understand the principle behind the rep that only comes through repetition and then gaining the skills to make it an instinct in everyday conversation.
Exactly. Yes. So you landed on that last piece of this has got to be reps in the field actually doing it that leads to us that becoming instinct, where it becomes just a part of us. And then to use Karsten's language from OKC, it begins to ooze out of us, right? This just begins to
Right.
become a part of us, right? And so
So
we've got
how
to
do
get to
you
that point.
see yeah, so how do you see this as far as the two church model? Like how do you actually make church and leading church ooze out of you? How does that
Right.
happen, Mark?
Yeah, I'm not anti workshop or anti webinar or anti YouTube video.
I hope
Man, I'd
not.
be the
We're on
biggest
there doing it
hypocrite.
right now.
What's that?
We're doing it right now. I hope
I
not.
know. I'd be the biggest hypocrite if I said, "Oh, you shouldn't do that stuff." It's like, Mark, you're on one of those right now. Yeah. So I think all those things have value. It's just that God's design that I read through the model of Jesus into the book of Acts. The ideal design is to do it with the disciples, and so the two church model is nothing more than saying, if I want to learn how to be a part of church and starting simple church, I need to go do it with people. So it's continuing this echo of the idea of withness. And so practically, I'm just going to make this super practical today. When we gather for church in New York City, the churches that gather, they share this same vision cast each time. We'll draw out a circle that has all of the practices of church from Acts chapter 2, verses 36 to 47. We call it the church waffle. A lot of you who listen to our podcast, you've heard this many times. We draw that out, and then we not only draw it out, we draw another one and say, these disciples in Acts 2 were a part of this church. But then if you fast forward on to Acts 8, this church began to multiply to Antioch, and a new place begins. Well, and even others around that time frame in the book of Acts. There's other churches that begin to start and multiply, and so it's not just that this church should start. We should be looking for opportunities in our passions, people's, places, professions to see this get started. And that doesn't happen as soon as everybody in this church has fully got it. It happens in parallel. And so people are launched out to begin to start engaging with the people around them with the gospel, looking for those casual, meaningful, spiritual discovery conversations, doing the habits and the rhythms in their workplace, on the pickleball court, as they're still a part of the simple church in somebody's house. They're beginning to do that with somebody else, and they can learn something and do it, learn something and do it. And this is God's design. Not that we would go to university for 4 years and then go start with all of this knowledge and all of this ideas, but have never field tested them. We should be field testing it right as we're learning it. So the two church model is saying, as you're learning a new command of Christ or a new practice you read in Acts 2, you're going to do it with somebody in your own world.
And I'm going to drop back a little bit and say um, there's some hesitancy because when you hear this, if you guys are listening in, it depends on the paradigm that you're listening to what we're talking to or talking about. It depends on what your frame of reference is when you're hearing what we're saying on whether or not you're going to understand and orient what we're talking about. And so we spent the first half of this podcast really unpacking the playing field that we're talking about, right? Where we're
Right.
saying we want to give opportunities for temporary incompetence. And so if you've got a certain mindset about church, that is, this is a place that is a ready made, joinable
Mm,
organization.
yes.
Okay. If it's a ready made, joinable organization and that you get all the pieces together and that you're healthy. And then once you're healthy, then you can start inviting people into that healthy organization. Then, if that's the only way that you can think about church, is this is going to be a really hard concept for you to work with because you're going to say, so wait a second, David Mark, you're saying that you want people to go out and to practice church temporarily incompetent,
Yeah.
that
It's a good.
you're wanting incompetent people
Yeah.
to go and to start churches. And if you're not in the playing field that we're talking about, you're going to be like, what are we talking about here? So help me, Mark. I'm gonna play the devil's advocate for you for a second. Help me understand what you mean whenever you say, yeah, the two church model, that I'm learning something in one church and then I'm going and doing it in another church. What does that look like? What does that second church look like, even practically?
So it looks practically like somebody who begins to say, I am going to adopt, I'm going to commit to this group in my life, this oikos in my life, and we'll just use the workplace where I've been talking with a guy this week in North Florida. He's really humming away in his workplace, and so I'm going to adopt my workplace, and I'm going to just begin to go and to engage in those conversations with people around me, and I'm going to open up my Bible. I'm going to begin to do the stuff that we do in church. And I'm not calling this church yet, but I'm saying, man, I want to do the stuff that we do in church, including sharing the gospel, which sometimes happens when we gather, but mostly that's going to be something that's as a getting started. I'm going to go do this in this place, and I'm going to begin to invite people that I meet to begin to discover Jesus, follow Jesus, and um, if they are ready to do that, we may begin to see this group of people within this workplace or within another part of my life begin to have rhythms together, begin to have a community of practice form together. And that community of practice is the origins of what church looks like. I think we see this in the Gospels as Jesus begins to gather at people's homes. I wouldn't call that a church, but I would call that some of the rhythms that could become a church gathering. So that would be how I would differentiate the two, Dave.
Yeah, and I think it's super helpful because what we're saying is we're letting people grow into it. And so we're not saying we want you to create something that is perfect and then go and use it. We're not saying we want you to build the thing.
That's
And
right.
when the thing is built, then you're ready. What we're saying is we want you to grow into it.
Yes.
We want you to become it. So when we're saying two church model, we're casting a vision for what something is so that you'll know what you're moving towards, right?
Yes.
So that you can become that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have arrived before you're ever able. And that's the whole point of this
Right.
discussion
Right.
is if someone is supposed to have arrived before they're able to do, then they're never going to be able to do because
Right.
the only way to arrive is to do the thing.
Yes. Yeah.
That's our whole point. You're right. I'm an old, this is going to be funny. And you're going to look at me and roll your eyes and you'd be like, okay, but I'm an old FFA member. People are going to be like, what is FFA? It's Future Farmers of America, used to be
Right.
whatever. The motto of FFA back whenever I was in high school was doing to learn, learning to do, earning to live, living to serve. That's what we're talking about. Doing to learn, learning to do, right? Yeah, it's like it's the way people function.
Yeah. I like it. I like it. Yeah. I think all of this begins to tee up the need for um, deeper conversation about church. And you're right. This we have a couple of tools that we use, Dave, which will way derail us, but just I want to mention them, called the handy guides to church. We can talk about the handy guide to church start and the handy guide to church health. And each are 5 things. So that's why it's handy guides. That maybe I can put those in the comments below this on the podcast so you guys to take a look at that. But Dave, you've always talked about when you do the church start, which is we see in Acts 2, then we've got Acts 6 comes along, right? And there's the widows not being
Mess.
taken care of and mess. But you always talk about, right, the mess in the middle between church start and church health. And so in saying the genius of the two church model, we're not saying, oh man, here's the silver bullet and everything's going to be super healthy and great. Honestly, it's the opposite, that we're actually leaning into the mess, not because we have a low view of church, but a high view, a high value for God's ability to work in the harvest, because we have this all throughout the Gospels and Acts, a high value for God's ability to work through ordinary people in the harvest, as they step into their priesthood, as they're called, as a priesthood of the believer, to step in to do the stuff that God has entrusted them to do. We trust that God is big enough and good enough and powerful enough to work out through habits and rhythms a healthy expression of church to emerge in this local level.
So let's look at a biblical example of this. And this podcast might run a little bit long today, but this is so core to the things that
Yes.
we like to talk about. We're always going to be a little bit more passionate and talk a little bit longer about this. Let's take the church of Antioch and let's ask 2 questions about it. How did they start and how did they get healthy? And I think when you look at the church of Antioch, you're going to see this extremely clearly. When the persecution broke out in Acts 8, Paul brings on the freedmen, and Paul's holding the coats. You see the stoning of Stephen. The church scatters. Well, whenever they scatter, where do they scatter to? Well, it says that there were some Gentiles who had heard the word and believed, and they were from Cyprus, and they landed at Antioch, and the church at Antioch was started with no apostles
Yeah.
of the 12. None of the official apostles, right? The capital A apostles that Jesus had appointed were a part of that. And they go and they start that church. And then Barnabas, who is actually someone who is just known as a leader in the church because he wasn't a deacon, he wasn't
Yeah.
a apostle, he wasn't an elder. He was a guy who sold his field and generously gave a lot of money, right? Because he was committed to what he was doing. Well, the church trusts him, so they sent him up there to check on the church at Antioch because they hear about what's going on. Well, Barnabas has already met this guy who's been converted named Saul. And he goes up to where Paul, now Saul, now Paul, was ministering in Cilicia in his hometown, planting churches. He grabs him and he says, come with me. We're going to go down to Antioch. And then when we see Paul's first missionary journey, it says that the teachers of that church were gathered and fasting and praying. And two
Yep.
of them that were mentioned who were there teaching and training and ministering and helping to mature that Antioch church was Paul and Barnabas.
Yep.
And what were they doing there? They were helping that church that got started mature as teachers and to grow. So it's a beautiful picture of you got ordinary, everyday people who came to Christ, lived within the church. And what happened in Jerusalem, whenever the persecution happens, they naturally just start another church where they landed in Antioch. And then some more mature disciples partnered up with them and helped them grow and to teach. And Antioch became the hub for the Gentile missions spread through all of Jerusalem. They started off as just a church with Gentiles, with ordinary people. God provided for them training and ministers and teachers who grew and raised and matured that church, and then they became a hub for everything that was going on. Such a beautiful picture of this model.
I love that that example is in the book of Acts, that it's explicitly saying that this was everybody except the apostles. That's an interesting
Yeah,
data point.
yeah.
And then secondly, Dave, this is the first place that they're called Christians. So
Hmm.
it would have been one thing if the apostles had gone and done this and started this, and then they were called Christians in Jerusalem. There'd be, oh, okay, well, this is, you could say lots of things about Antioch, but the fact that this was started by the ordinary people was messy, and then they had to come along and say, how do we strengthen and bring this to health, that they were called Christians here, experienced persecution, and then this becomes a major hub. All of that tells us that this is a part of God's plan, that ordinary people could be released to go and to start And then, but that God does want to grow these simple expressions that start that way towards health along the way.
And so here's the beauty, Mark, in our conversation is not only do we want to have disciples who have temporary incompetence as they try and they grow and they learn, we also have to give churches temporary incompetence as
Yes.
bodies,
Yeah.
as gatherings of people. We have to give churches room to grow. And we have to give them the freedom to say that mistakes are going to be made and that we're going to grow from them. So we want to fail first, fail fast, fail forward. And I think sometimes when we have this conversation, we have such high expectations that people think I have to go from zero to expectation. And we're just saying, keep the high expectations.
Right.
We
Right.
want to go to full on biblical, healthy, God honoring, God multiplying churches, right? Because in the right hand, we would say there's four signs of maturity, right? Where they're self reproducing, they're self correcting, they're self governing, right? We
Right.
want those things to happen, but we just got to let them grow. And that's the beauty. That's where we learn. That's where disciples are reproduced. And to kick it back to you, that's why there's the genius of the two church model.
Yeah. And there's one other piece that I want to hit on, Dave, as we begin to close this out. We've talked about a lot today, but I think you're right that when we have this conversation, it's important to bring in all these pieces because people come from lots of different backgrounds as they talk about this. One other piece I want to talk about for the genius of the two church model that I forgot to mention already is I think sometimes I'll speak from my own experience when I've been a part of another church model, a more traditional church model. I led in that as a pastor for years in the traditional church model. Um, I think we assume that it is healthier and that people will grow more and better through it, and we assume that people have all that they need, and that a simple church inherently is going to be more unhealthy. And one of the things I've experienced in the simple church that I did not in the traditional model is high accountability for my disciple making and for what God is doing in my life as a leader, His formation in my life. Accountability is much easier and more consistent in in around the dinner table than it is on a Sunday morning in the pew. If it happens, I've never had it happen in that setting, and the reason for that is you're in each other's lives, and you actually begin to, as you're engaging in content, you're able to say, "What are you doing with that?" And so this allows learning to accelerate. Is where I was going with that. When you have a two church model, learning accelerates because accountability is a part of it. I'm doing it and I'm reproducing it. I'm doing it and I'm reproducing it. And in that process, it accelerates somebody who could be in the kingdom and walking with Jesus and has sat on Sundays for 15 years can be outpaced by somebody who's been doing this for a year or two because they are learning it and they're doing it and accountable. How's that going? How's that going? And they quickly are practicing and growing through putting in those reps.
In my experience, Mark, churches make it if they have a leader who's responsible, and churches don't make it if they don't have a leader who takes responsibility. I could almost across the board say if you don't have a group of people who has someone there who says, I will be responsible to make sure that this ministry, this work, this group of people is supported,
Yes.
then it's not going to go. Which, if anybody was listening closely, I said four signs of maturity, and I already gave three. And they probably are like, well, what's the fourth one? The fourth one is self supporting. That's the fourth one. And most of the time when we say self supporting, we automatically go to what? Money. Can
100%.
they pay their own when they pay their own bills? But the truth is there's way more to supporting a church than money. We know throwing more money at things is not going to fix problems. People are the problem, people are the answer. It's the way the world works. People are always the problem, people are always the answer, and you have to have someone who's going to support that. So even if I'm in a traditional or a long-standing, maybe a church has been around for a number of years, generally speaking, the expectation is the most mature in the group are going to be the leaders, and the leaders
Yes.
are the most mature in the group.
Yes.
And I will tell you why. Because whenever you lead, you have to get mature because your job is to support the congregation. And to your point, the accountability of a smaller structure in the two church structure, when you have somebody that says, hey, come with me and let me help you begin to learn to support another group of growing disciples, they will mature in leadership exponentially faster. What you just said, it creates the environment to where that person goes, I'm no longer a taker, I'm a giver. And when you have someone who learns to be a giver in the kingdom, then that's whenever they just grow. They grow in faith, they grow in knowledge, they grow in skill sets, all of the things, because the responsibility pushes them to get better at what they're doing.
Yeah, so our goal today in this podcast episode, Dave, was to offer up, I believe, a pretty biblical model, which you really helped us to see specifically through Antioch, but to see a biblical model for training that allows the reproducing of the things that we're learning to happen not just intuitively, but I put it this way in my notes: people rarely reproduce what they understand, they reproduce what they practice. And so at the end of the day, it can't just be, I've understood this stuff, I've seen this stuff, I've heard this stuff. And we can even, it can be almost like this subtle trick for us as leaders. I want to now step into this idea of addressing leaders, that we can think that we have done our job and we have shared all the content and more that a disciple might need. But unless I am training up those leaders with them as a part of giving them responsibility, which we always say is like fertilizer, when they have that responsibility as a part of the church gathering with me, and then I'm giving them responsibility to begin to start those rhythms, those habits, like they did in Antioch, to going up to Antioch, it begins to grow them up into the ability to have the competence that they need to actually do the stuff. So God's design of two churches, being a part of a church and then being launched out to start a church, is the accelerant way to raise up disciples that can do this stuff.
And to tie a bow on it, I want to prompt you for something that you're really passionate about and a conviction that, especially in your time in New York, has really solidified. What do you believe the primary training grounds of the kingdom of God is and why?
Yeah, I think the primary training ground is the church, and it's because this actually begins to um, cause people to have to live it out, to work it out with one another together. And I think it's, I'll often say, you can't baptize yourself, is one just tongue in cheek way of talking about the critical need for church, right? Is like,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna get in trouble for this, but my wife actually, when she was like 20 and she came to faith, was in a simple church gathering and she heard the gospel and she's like, I have to follow Jesus right now. She went in the bathroom, she filled up the tub, and she went under the water. And she came out and she was like, guys, I just got baptized, and they were like, you can't do that. And so they took her back in and they walked her through it, and she got baptized. So anyway, the point is, God's design for church is critical because it's with one another, and living out and doing this stuff is the way in which we become a part of the kingdom, and we actually work through all of the soft skills and the reality of the mess of how to actually do it in real life. And then we take somebody else into their mess, and then they can actually do it rather than just doing it in a sanitized classroom.
Well, to get you a little bit out of trouble, we'll point out that the whole Anabaptist movement that is hundreds of years old was started by a guy who did the exact same thing, right? Right. So
There you go.
it's okay. It's okay. We learn as we go, and do that. Mark, I really appreciate you bringing up this subject today, and really just getting an opportunity for you to explain that very concept of why the church is the primary training grounds of the kingdom, and how we can give people the opportunity to have that temporary incompetence, give them a place to learn that's the actual hands on apprenticeship environment that goes beyond knowledge and gives them the skill set and the ability to deal with the hard issues and to see all of that come around and us really see leaders emerge in the kingdom so we can multiply even more.
Amen. Well, hey, one of our favorite examples of this is Aquila and Priscilla. And we see them in the book of Acts emerge as these quiet heroes that had church in their house everywhere they went. and then they helped others to do that as well. We have a lab coming up July 15. It's always on the third Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central. It's a 45-minute. We just get in it and we get after it, and that'll give some handholds and some practicals for some of the things we've talked about today. You'll be able to find that in the notes below or at covomultipliers.com. We'd love to see you on that call. Thanks for this time today, Dave.
See you next time.
Bye.